On my 29th birthday, exactly 47 minutes after my plane from Seattle landed in Dallas, I watched my husband's car drive past the arrivals lane without slowing down. He wasn't alone. There was a woman in the passenger seat, laughing, her hand resting on his shoulder like it had been there 1,000 times. I stood there with one suitcase, one garment bag, and a message from him that simply said, "Running late, wait for me." If you've ever been the last person to realize your own life has already changed, you know that strange, quiet moment when something inside you goes cold instead of breaking. Before I continue, tell me in the comments, have you ever caught someone you trusted in a lie without them knowing you saw it? Because that was the exact moment I decided I wouldn't confront him. Not yet. My name is Cassandra Lee Porter. I was 29 years old that day, and I cleaned executive offices at a high-rise building in downtown Dallas for a living. Not glamorous, not impressive. But that job taught me one thing most people never learn. You see everything when people think you're invisible. My husband, Daniel Michael Porter, was supposed to pick me up at 6:20 p.m. He knew my flight number. He knew I'd been gone for 5 weeks training in Seattle for a new building management certification, something he'd insisted I pursue because, in his words, "We need to move up in life, Cass." I remember watching the digital clock above the baggage claim flip from 6:47 to 6:48. And I remember the exact second I realized the woman in his car was Melissa Grant, his executive assistant, 26, blonde, always smiling too politely when I visited Daniel's office. I didn't run after the car. I didn't call him. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened the rideshare app, and booked a $42 Uber home. Because something about the way her hand rested on him, not tentative, not nervous, just comfortable, told me this wasn't new. This was routine. During the ride, Daniel called twice, then texted, "Traffic is insane. Where are you?" I typed back, "Still waiting." I stared at that lie for a long time before hitting send. You might wonder why I didn't explode right then, why I didn't scream, cry, demand answers. But here's the truth most revenge stories never tell you. Shock doesn't feel loud. It feels surgical. It cuts clean and silent. When I got home at 7:32 p.m., the house looked exactly the same as when I left 5 weeks earlier. The same gray throw blanket folded on the couch. The same framed wedding photo above the fireplace. But something was off. It took me less than 10 seconds to see it. There were 2 wine glasses in the sink, not just used, freshly rinsed. Water droplets still clung to the rims. I stood there staring at them, and in that moment, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. Melissa Grant had been in my house, and Daniel hadn't planned on me noticing. At 8:05 p.m., his car pulled into the driveway. I heard him grab his briefcase, rush inside, and call out with forced cheerfulness, "Cass, babe, I'm so sorry. Traffic was insane." I stayed in the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter. When he walked in, he froze for half a second, just a fraction too long. That was the first crack. Then he smiled, too wide. He came toward me, arms open, smelling like a restaurant garlic butter and expensive cologne. "I missed you," he said. I hugged him back, and that was when I saw it. A faint smudge of coral lipstick on the inside collar of his white dress shirt. Not my shade. I stepped back and said calmly, "You look tired." He laughed. "Work's been crazy without you around." Without you around. The words hung there because I suddenly realized something else. He hadn't asked me a single question about my trip. Not one. Not about the training. Not about my flight. Not even how I was feeling. He just kept talking about himself. That's when I knew. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. We sat down for dinner leftovers he'd reheated, and he filled the silence with stories about office deadlines and client meetings. Melissa's name came up twice, both times casually. Too casually. And here's where it gets interesting. Because at 9:14 p.m., his phone lit up on the table. A message preview appeared on the lock screen. Just 5 words. Did she suspect anything? From Melissa G. I didn't react. I didn't blink. I simply took a sip of water and kept listening to him talk. That was the exact moment the first layer of truth settled into place. He wasn't just cheating. He thought he was smarter than me. Let me ask you something. If you saw that message on your spouse's phone, would you confront them immediately? Or would you wait? Because I chose to wait. And Daniel had no idea that decision would eventually cost him everything. Later that night, after he fell asleep beside me, breathing steady, peaceful, like a man with nothing to fear, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. That's when I started replaying the past year in my mind. All the late meetings, all the urgent client dinners, all the times he encouraged me to work extra shifts. And then one memory hit me like a whisper from somewhere deeper. 3 months earlier, Daniel had insisted on refinancing our house. At the time, he said it was to consolidate debt. I signed the paperwork without questioning him, because I trusted him. But as I lay there in the dark, one question formed slowly, quietly, and refused to leave. Why did he need my signature so urgently? I turned my head and looked at him sleeping beside me. And for the first time in 7 years of marriage, I didn't feel anger. I felt distance, cold, steady distance. Because deep down, I knew this story wasn't just about an affair. It was about something else. Something financial. Something legal. Something he thought I would never notice. And the next morning, at exactly 6:12 a.m., I found the first piece of proof hidden inside a folder in his home office drawer. A document with both our names on it, and a number printed at the bottom that made my stomach drop. $3,270 But what terrified me most wasn't the amount. It was the date on the document, because it had been signed 2 weeks ago, while I was still in Seattle. 2 weeks before Christmas, at exactly 6:12 in the morning, I stood in Daniel's home office, holding a document that said I had agreed to a $327,000 home equity loan I had never seen before. My signature was on the last page, neat, perfect, identical to how I always sign my name, except I hadn't signed it. Not then. Not ever. If you've ever realized someone you trusted might have committed fraud using your name, you know that moment when your body doesn't react right away. It's like your mind refuses to process the danger because it would change everything too fast. That's exactly how it felt. Cold. Still. Precise. I closed the folder carefully and slid it back into the drawer exactly as I found it. I even aligned the edges so it looked untouched. Years of cleaning corporate offices had trained me to notice details most people overlooked. Daniel was still asleep upstairs. For a second, I stood there, listening to the faint hum of the HVAC system and his steady breathing through the ceiling vents. Then I pulled out my phone and took 3 photos of the document, not in a panic, not shaking, just methodical. Because something in me already understood this wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about control, about money, about planning. And Daniel Michael Porter had clearly been planning something for a long time. I went upstairs at 6:24 a.m. and started making coffee like nothing had happened. When Daniel came down at 6:41, he kissed my cheek and said, "Morning, birthday girl." Birthday girl. As if the night before hadn't happened. As if I hadn't watched him drive past me with another woman in his car. As if my name hadn't just appeared on a fraudulent loan agreement. I smiled back. Morning. If you're wondering how someone can act normal in a moment like that, here's the truth. When you know you're being lied to, sometimes calmness isn't weakness. It's strategy. He sat down, scrolling through emails on his phone, and said casually, "I was thinking we should talk about finances soon. Maybe after the holidays?" I stirred my coffee slowly. "Sure," I said. Because that single sentence confirmed something important. He thought I didn't know. He thought he still controlled the timeline. He thought he had time. He didn't. At 7:03 a.m., his phone buzzed again on the table. Melissa Grant. This time I could see more of the preview. "Lunch today? Need to talk about the wire transfer." Wire transfer. The words landed like ice in my chest, but I didn't react. I simply asked, "Busy day today?" He locked his phone quickly. Too quickly. "Yeah," he said. "End of year stuff." Of course. End of year. Perfect timing for moving money. He left for work at 7:32 a.m., and the moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. Here's something Daniel never fully understood about me. Cleaning offices isn't just wiping surfaces. You learn systems. You learn paperwork. You learn how businesses track money. And during my certification training in Seattle, I'd spent 5 weeks studying property management law. including financing structures and lien documentation, which meant I knew exactly where to start. The loan company name was printed clearly at the top of the document. I called them at 8:02 a.m. The representative answered with a polite, practiced voice. "Thank you for calling Horizon Equity Lending," I said calmly. "Hi, I'm calling about a loan account under the name Cassandra Lee Porter." There was a brief pause as she typed. Then she said something that made my stomach drop even further. "Yes, Mrs. Porter. The funds were dispersed 2 weeks ago. Is there an issue with your payment schedule?" Funds were dispersed. Not pending. Not approved. Already gone. I swallowed carefully and asked, "Can you confirm where the funds were transferred?" Another pause. Then she said, "I'm sorry, ma'am. For security reasons, we can only discuss that information with both account holders present." Both account holders. Daniel had made sure of that. He had structured the loan so I couldn't access details without him, which meant he knew exactly what he was doing. That was the second confirmation. This wasn't reckless behavior. It was deliberate. I hung up at 8:11 a.m., and that's when the first real wave of anger hit. Not explosive, not loud, just heavy. Because I finally understood something that hurt more than the affair itself. Daniel hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. He had used me, legally, used my name, my credit, my future, for something he hadn't even told me about. Let me ask you something. What would you do if you discovered your spouse secretly took out hundreds of thousands of dollars in your name? Would you confront them right away, or would you keep digging? Because I chose to dig. At 9:18 a.m., I drove to the bank where we held our joint checking account. I requested a full transaction history for the past 90 days. The teller printed 18 pages. I sat down in the lobby and started reading, line by line. And there it was. 3 transfers, all within 48 hours of the loan disbursement. $150,000 wired to a business account under the name MG Consulting, LLC. $90,000 transferred to an investment brokerage account I didn't recognize. $40,000 withdrawn in cashier's checks. MG Consulting. Melissa Grant. My hands didn't shake. They went completely still. Because now, the first layer of truth had fully locked into place. This wasn't just an affair. They were financially connected, working together, planning something, and Daniel had used my name to fund it. But here's what he didn't know. While I was sitting there in that quiet bank lobby, staring at those numbers, one detail caught my attention. At the bottom of the transfer receipt for MG Consulting, there was a note line, 5 simple words. Property acquisition, Phase 1. Phase 1, which meant there was a Phase 2. And as I walked out of the bank at exactly 10:02 a.m., one thought echoed clearly in my mind. Whatever Daniel and Melissa were planning, it wasn't finished yet. 3 days before New Year's Eve, at exactly 10:02 in the morning, I walked out of my bank holding 18 pages of transaction records that proved $280,000 had been moved without my knowledge. The winter sun was bright, sharp, almost painfully clear. The kind of light that makes it impossible to pretend you don't see what's right in front of you. And in black ink, at the bottom of one transfer receipt, 5 words sat quietly like a threat. Property acquisition, Phase 1. If you've ever realized that betrayal wasn't an accident, but a coordinated plan, you know that terrifying moment when everything suddenly starts making sense in the worst possible way. Before I go further, tell me honestly in the comments, would you still trust someone after discovering they secretly tied your finances to another person? Because that morning, I realized something I couldn't unsee. Daniel wasn't just cheating. He was building something with her, and he had funded it, using me. I drove home slowly, my mind running through numbers, timelines, possibilities. Years of cleaning corporate offices had taught me how deals worked, the language executives used when they thought nobody important was listening. Phase 1 almost always meant one thing in business. It meant the plan was still unfolding. And that meant I still had time. Time was suddenly the most valuable asset I had. I got home at 10:37 a.m. and went straight to Daniel's office again. This time, I wasn't searching blindly. I knew exactly what I was looking for. Not just documents, but patterns. Because people like Daniel didn't leave one piece of evidence. They left trails. Inside the bottom drawer, behind the loan folder, I found a thin black notebook. Not hidden deeply, just placed casually, like something he assumed I'd never think to open. Inside were handwritten notes in his clean, precise script. Dates, dollar amounts, short phrases. I flipped through carefully until one page stopped me cold. December 2nd, loan finalized. December 4th, MGLLC funded. December 6th, site inspection with M. December 9th, Cass, still in Seattle. Safe. Safe. He had written the word safe, as if I were an obstacle he needed out of the way. As if my absence wasn't something he missed, it was something he relied on. My chest tightened, but my hands stayed steady, because that word confirmed something that shifted everything inside me. This wasn't impulsive betrayal. It was calculated, deliberate, planned around my movements, around my life, around my trust. I turned the page, and that's where I saw the first real glimpse of what they were building. Purchase target, commercial property, Oak Ridge District. Oak Ridge. I knew that area immediately. It was a rapidly developing section of Dallas, filled with older office buildings being converted into luxury co-working spaces. Property values there had jumped nearly 40% in the past 2 years, which meant one thing. Daniel wasn't just moving money. He was investing, using funds tied to my name, my credit, my legal liability. And here's what made my stomach twist even harder. At the bottom of the page, written in bold pen strokes, was a single sentence. Transfer title after divorce final. Divorce. Not if. After. He had already planned it. Planned to leave me with a debt. Planned to move the asset into Melissa's company. Planned to walk away clean. For the first time since this started, my breathing faltered, not because I was shocked, but because I suddenly understood the full scope of what he intended. He wasn't just betraying me. He was preparing to erase me financially. Let me ask you something. What hurts more? Someone breaking your heart, or someone trying to destroy your future while smiling at you every day? Because at that moment, I realized something very important about Daniel Michael Porter. He believed I was too small to fight back, too quiet, too invisible, too just a cleaning woman. That assumption would become his biggest mistake. I put the notebook back exactly where I found it and closed the drawer. Then I sat at the desk and stared at the wall for a long time, letting the reality settle into something sharper, because anger fades quickly, but clarity stays. And clarity brought a new question. How much did Melissa know? Was she being manipulated too? Or was she an equal partner in this? The answer came sooner than I expected. At exactly 12:18 p.m., my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I answered. Hello? There was a short pause. Then a female voice said quietly, Cassandra? I recognized it immediately. Melissa Grant. My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. Speaking, I said. Another pause. Then she said something that shifted the ground beneath my feet. Daniel told me you'd be at work today. Not hello, not polite. Just that, he told me. Which meant they had talked about my schedule, discussed my whereabouts, planned around me, I said evenly. I took the day off. Silence stretched for 2 seconds. Then she exhaled slowly, and her next words landed like a stone in still water. We need to talk. Not want. Need. I didn't respond immediately, because in her voice there was something unexpected. Not arrogance. Not defensiveness. Something closer to tension. Fear, maybe. She continued, lower now. There's something Daniel didn't tell you. My grip tightened slightly on the phone, because that single sentence opened an entirely new possibility. What if the plan wasn't as simple as I thought? What if there was another layer? Another truth beneath the financial betrayal? I finally spoke. About what? There was a long pause on the line, so long I thought she might hang up. But then she said quietly, about whose name the property is really going under. The line went silent after that. She didn't explain further. She didn't elaborate. She just said, I can't talk on the phone. Not about this. And before I could ask anything else, she added one final sentence. Meet me tonight, 7 o'clock, Riverside parking garage. Then she hung up. I stood there holding the phone, staring at nothing. Because suddenly, the situation wasn't just about Daniel's betrayal anymore. It was about something bigger, something Melissa was afraid to say out loud. And as I looked at the clock, 12:26 p.m., One question formed slowly in my mind. If the property wasn't going into Melissa's name, then whose name had Daniel really planned to use? On New Year's Eve, at exactly 6:58 p.m., I sat alone in my car on the third level of Riverside parking garage, watching the digital clock on my dashboard tick down, knowing that in 2 minutes I would come face to face with the woman my husband had been lying to me with for months, and possibly stealing from me with for years. The concrete structure smelled like oil and cold metal. Distant city fireworks were already popping in the sky, early celebrations echoing through the open sides of the garage, and my hands were completely steady on the steering wheel. If you've ever waited for a confrontation you didn't fully understand yet, you know the strange calm that comes right before truth arrives. Not explosive, just heavy, like gravity shifting. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If the person your spouse cheated with asked to meet you secretly, would you go alone? Because I did. Not because I trusted Melissa Grant, but because I trusted something else. Information. At exactly 7:01 p.m., a black sedan pulled into the row opposite me. Melissa stepped out, scanning the area quickly before walking toward my car. She looked different than I remembered from Daniel's office, less polished. Her blonde hair was pulled back tightly. No makeup except faint mascara smudges under her eyes, like she hadn't slept. She stopped 3 feet from my window and hesitated. I lowered it halfway. Neither of us smiled. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then she said quietly, "You know about the loan." Not a question, a statement. I nodded once. Her shoulders sagged slightly, not in guilt, but in what looked like relief. "I thought so," she murmured. That reaction hit me unexpectedly. Relief wasn't what I expected from a woman involved in an affair, which meant one thing. This situation wasn't as simple as I'd assumed. I spoke calmly. "Start talking." She glanced around again before stepping closer. Her voice dropped low. "I didn't know he used your name." For the first time, something flickered inside me. Not belief. Not yet, just uncertainty. Because if she was lying, she was very good at it. She continued quickly, like someone afraid of running out of time. "He told me you were separating, that you agreed to help finance a joint investment so you both could split assets cleanly." Separating. The word landed like a cold slap, because Daniel hadn't mentioned separation once. Not in conversations, not in behavior, not in anything. Melissa went on, her words rushing now. "He said you wanted out quietly, that this was your idea, to protect your credit while you moved to another state after the divorce." My jaw tightened, because suddenly everything clicked into a sharper, uglier shape. Daniel hadn't just lied to me. He'd created an entirely different reality for her. 2 separate stories, 2 different versions of the truth, both designed to serve him. I asked evenly. "And you believed that?" She flinched slightly. "At first, yes." Her eyes dropped for a moment. "Because he showed me documents, your signature, emails, messages." My stomach tightened again. Emails, messages, things I had never written, which meant something far more serious than just financial deception. It meant identity fraud, and the realization settled in slowly, heavily. Daniel hadn't just manipulated money. He had constructed an entire false narrative using my name. I said quietly, "So what changed?" Melissa swallowed. Then she said something that shifted the ground beneath me again. "Last week, I found out the property isn't going under my company." I held her gaze. "Then whose?" She hesitated. For a second, I saw real fear in her eyes. Not guilt, not shame, fear. Finally, she whispered, "A shell corporation in Delaware." The words hit like ice water. Because shell corporations had one purpose: to hide ownership, to conceal liability, to erase accountability. I asked, "Who owns it?" Her lips parted. But she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she said something else first. "Cassandra, Daniel isn't just planning to divorce you." My pulse slowed, every sense sharpening. "What do you mean?" Her voice dropped even lower. "He's planning to disappear." Silence filled the space between us. The distant fireworks sounded suddenly very far away. I stared at her. "Explain." She shook her head slightly, like she couldn't believe she was saying it. "He's been moving money for months. Not just this loan. Other accounts, retirement funds, business reimbursements. Everything." Each word felt like another piece of a puzzle falling into place. Late nights, secret calls, encouraging me to travel, rushing paperwork. It all pointed toward one terrifying possibility. Melissa continued, her voice trembling now. He told me we were going to start a new company together, somewhere overseas. He said everything would be transferred by March. 3 months away. That was his timeline. I felt something inside me shift again. Not shock, not anger, something colder. Because now I understood the real scope of his plan. He wasn't just trying to leave me. He was trying to erase his financial identity completely and leave me legally responsible for the debt. I asked the most important question. And what happens to me in his plan? Melissa met my eyes, and her answer came out, barely above a whisper. You get left with the liability. There it was. The third confirmation. Complete and undeniable. He planned to vanish, leave the debt in my name, and start a new life, funded by money stolen through me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Melissa said something unexpected. I didn't call you because of guilt. I raised an eyebrow slightly. Then why? She took a shaky breath. Because last night, I found out something else. My body went very still. What? She hesitated. Her eyes darted toward the ramp entrance of the garage. Then she leaned closer to the window and whispered 5 words that made my blood run cold. He's already transferred the house. The words hung in the air between us. Impossible, I said slowly. That's not possible. My name. She shook her head urgently. That's what I thought too, but I saw the paperwork this morning. My heart began to pound, not from panic, but from the sheer scale of what I was hearing. Because if that was true, it meant something far worse than fraud had already happened, and Melissa's final sentence confirmed it. He forged more than your signature, Cassandra. She swallowed hard. He forged your consent. At exactly 7:19 p.m. on New Year's Eve, while fireworks echoed over the Dallas skyline, I sat in my car inside Riverside parking garage, listening to the woman my husband had been sleeping with tell me he had already transferred ownership of our house without my knowledge. And the first thing I felt wasn't panic. It was a strange, hollow stillness, like the moment after glass shatters, when the pieces haven't fallen yet. Because if you've ever realized someone hasn't just betrayed you emotionally, but legally rewritten your life behind your back, you know there's a point where shock stops being an emotion and becomes something colder. Calculation. Before I continue, I want you to think about this. What would you do if you found out your spouse didn't just plan to leave you, but had already begun erasing you on paper? Because that was exactly what Daniel Michael Porter had done. I forced my voice to stay even. Explain, I said. Melissa nodded quickly, as if she'd been waiting for that word. This morning, he left his briefcase open at the office. I wasn't snooping. I was trying to find a contract file he asked for. But there was a notarized document on top. My stomach tightened slightly. Deed transfer authorization, she continued. Your name and his. Signed, witnessed, notarized. The air inside my chest felt suddenly heavier, because notarized meant something very specific. It meant a licensed notary public had verified the signatures, which meant one of 2 things. Either Daniel had found someone willing to break the law, or he had impersonated me convincingly enough to pass identity verification. Both possibilities were terrifying. Melissa swallowed before adding quietly, the property was transferred into the same Delaware corporation, the shell company, the same hidden entity tied to the loan money, which meant Daniel wasn't just moving cash. He was consolidating assets under an identity no one could easily trace. He was building an exit strategy, and I had been unknowingly funding it. I leaned back slowly in my seat. For a moment, I said nothing, because anger was useless here. Panic was useless. What mattered now was clarity, and clarity was starting to form, piece by piece. I asked, did you see the company name? She nodded. Orchid Harbor Holdings, LLC. The name sounded almost elegant, calm, harmless, which made it even more sinister. Because companies like that existed for one purpose: to conceal the real owner behind layers of legal paperwork. I asked quietly, who's listed as managing member? Melissa hesitated again, and this time, the fear in her eyes deepened. That's the part I don't understand, she whispered. It's not Daniel. My mind sharpened instantly. Then who? She swallowed. The paperwork lists someone named Eleanor V. Porter. For a second, the words didn't register. Then they hit all at once. Eleanor V. Porter, Daniel's mother. The woman who had never liked me. The woman who once told me, at our wedding rehearsal dinner, "Men like my son outgrow girls who clean offices." The woman who had smiled politely at me for 7 years while making sure I always felt just slightly unwelcome. And now her name sat at the center of this entire scheme. A cold realization settled into place. This hadn't just been Daniel's plan. It had been a family plan. Melissa continued quietly. "I didn't know who she was at first, but when I asked Daniel, he said she was just a temporary trustee." Temporary. The word felt like poison because I knew exactly what it meant. It meant he was hiding ownership through a trusted relative. It meant the assets could later be transferred back to him without legal scrutiny. And it meant something else. Something even darker. He had never intended to give Melissa anything either. She wasn't a partner. She was a tool, used just like me. That realization seemed to hit her at the same moment. Her voice trembled slightly. "He lied to both of us." I held her gaze. "Yes," I said quietly, "but only one of us signed the debt." Silence fell between us, because that was the brutal truth. No matter how much he manipulated Melissa emotionally, legally, I was the one at risk, the one tied to the loan, the one whose credit, future, and financial stability were hanging by a thread. Let me ask you something. What's worse, discovering someone betrayed you, or realizing they designed a system where you would carry all the consequences? Because that's the moment I understood just how deep Daniel's betrayal went. Melissa spoke again, her voice urgent now. "There's more." Of course there was. There was always more. "What?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "The deed transfer date is January 15th. My pulse slowed even further. January 15th, 2 weeks away, which meant something critical. The transfer hadn't finalized yet. There was still a window, a narrow one, but a window nonetheless. Melissa continued. "The notary stamp is dated, but the filing hasn't been processed with the county yet. It's scheduled to go through in 2 weeks. Relief didn't come. But something close to it did. Opportunity. Because until that filing happened, the transfer wasn't legally complete, which meant Daniel's plan was still vulnerable. For the first time that night, a faint, controlled clarity settled over me. I asked carefully, "Why are you telling me this?" Melissa looked down, then back up. "Because I realized this morning that when everything is transferred, he won't need me anymore either." Her voice cracked slightly. "He already has the money. He already has the property. He already has a company set up overseas." I studied her for a long moment. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "Where?" She froze. Her lips parted slightly. "Where what? Where is he planning to go?" She hesitated, long enough to confirm she knew the answer. Finally, she whispered, "Costa Rica." The word hung in the air like a final piece of a puzzle, clicking into place. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The hidden accounts, the shell company, the timing, the urgency. Daniel wasn't just escaping a marriage. He was preparing to disappear beyond easy legal reach. And he had almost succeeded. Almost. I sat there in silence for several seconds, letting the full picture settle into a single, sharp truth. Daniel Michael Porter believed I was powerless. He believed I would only discover the betrayal after it was too late. He believed he had already won. But he didn't know something that changed everything. Because at exactly 7:41 p.m., as I finally opened my mouth to respond, I realized there was one piece of information Melissa hadn't asked about. One detail Daniel had never considered. One advantage I had that neither of them fully understood. And it had nothing to do with money. It had to do with access. Because for the past 3 years, I hadn't just been cleaning corporate offices in that downtown high-rise. I had been cleaning one very specific office every night. The office of a senior partner at the law firm that handled property fraud cases for half of Dallas County. And sitting in his desk drawer was a business card he once told me to take if I ever needed real protection. On January 2nd, at exactly 8:13 in the morning, I stood outside a 42-story glass tower in downtown Dallas, holding a business card that had been sitting in a lawyer's desk drawer for nearly 3 years. A card I had never imagined I would actually use. Printed in dark blue ink were the words, Thomas Gregory Whitaker, Esquire. Senior Partner, Whitaker and Boone LLP. Property Fraud and Financial Crimes Division. And beneath his name, a number I had memorized long before that morning. Because if you've ever worked in a place where powerful people forget you exist, you learn something important. Invisible people hear everything. Before I stepped inside, I want to ask you something. If you discovered your spouse had forged legal documents and planned to disappear overseas, would you go straight to the police? Or would you quietly prepare first? Because I chose to prepare. The lobby doors slid open at 8:15 a.m., and the polished marble floor reflected the winter light in sharp lines. The air smelled faintly of expensive coffee and cleaning chemicals, a scent I knew better than most. I had spent hundreds of nights in this building after hours, vacuuming carpets while executives discussed lawsuits worth millions. And 3 years earlier, one conversation had stuck with me. It happened late one evening when Mr. Whitaker himself had still been working past 9 p.m. I'd been emptying trash bins when he'd said casually, "You know, Cassandra, people like you see the early signs of fraud long before clients do." I'd smiled politely, thinking he was just making conversation. Then he added something else. "If you ever find yourself in trouble because someone underestimated you, call me first." At the time, I thought it was just kindness. Now I understood. It had been something more. Experience. He had recognized the look of someone who paid attention. I approached the reception desk at 8:18 a.m. The receptionist glanced up. Professional, but distant. "Yes?" I placed the business card on the counter. "I need to speak with Mr. Whitaker. It's urgent, and it concerns property fraud involving my legal identity." Her expression shifted instantly, because those were not casual words. She picked up the phone and spoke quietly. 30 seconds later, she nodded at me. "Please take the elevator to the 39th floor, conference room C." The elevator ride felt strangely calm, not tense, not emotional, just steady. Because for the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting. I was taking control. Mr. Whitaker was already seated when I entered the conference room at 8:24 a.m. He looked exactly as I remembered. Mid-50s, silver hair, sharp eyes that missed nothing. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Cassandra," he said, recognizing me immediately. "You wouldn't be here unless this was serious." I sat down across from him and placed 3 items on the table. Photos of the loan document, bank transfer records, a handwritten copy of the notebook notes. His eyes scanned the pages quickly, professionally. Then he leaned back slightly. "This is substantial." I nodded. He forged my signature on a $327,000 home equity loan, transferred funds to a shell corporation, attempted deed transfer scheduled for filing in 2 weeks. Mr. Whitaker's expression grew colder with each sentence. When I finished, he folded his hands. "And you believe he intends to leave the country?" "Yes," I said. He was silent for several seconds. Then he said something that confirmed how serious this situation truly was. "This isn't just civil fraud. This is criminal conspiracy, identity theft, financial exploitation, and interstate transfer of illicit funds." The words landed with quiet weight. Because until that moment, everything had felt personal. Now, it was legal, real, structured. He continued, voice precise. "If the deed filing goes through, you would remain liable for the loan while losing ownership rights. It's a classic asset stripping strategy." Classic, meaning Daniel's plan wasn't even original. It was a known scheme, which meant there were also known ways to stop it. I asked the most important question. "Can it be prevented?" Mr. Whitaker nodded once. Yes, that single word felt like oxygen. But he didn't smile, because nothing about this situation was simple. "However," he added, "we need direct evidence of fraudulent intent, not just financial movement." My mind sharpened. "What kind of evidence?" He tapped the table lightly. "Proof that he knowingly forged her consent. Proof that he intends to transfer assets under false ownership. Proof tying him directly to the shell corporation." I thought immediately of Daniel's notebook, Melissa's testimony, the messages. But before I could respond, Mr. Whitaker said something else that shifted everything. "There's another complication." My chest tightened slightly. "What?" He slid one document back toward me. "The managing member listed for this shell company Eleanor V. Porter, gives him legal insulation. I nodded slowly. His mother. He continued, voice calm but firm. If she claimed she believed everything was legitimate, prosecution becomes significantly harder, which meant something critical. Daniel hadn't just protected himself financially. He had created a legal shield through family, and suddenly the scale of his planning felt even larger. I asked quietly, "What do we do?" Mr. Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "We don't act immediately." That answer surprised me, but he continued before I could question it. "If we confront him now, he can destroy evidence, move funds offshore faster, or accelerate his departure," which made perfect sense. A cornered man with money and a passport could vanish quickly. "We need him to continue believing you don't know," he said. I nodded slowly, because that was exactly what I had been doing instinctively. But then he said something that made my pulse slow even further. "We let him complete Phase 2. I stared at him. "What is Phase 2? Mr. Whitaker met my eyes. "Based on these notes, Phase 2 likely involves final asset consolidation, transferring remaining funds, and finalizing corporate ownership." He paused. "That's when he becomes legally vulnerable, because that would create a clear trail of intent, a clear chain linking him directly to fraud." He continued quietly, "If we time this correctly, Cassandra, we can stop the deed filing, freeze the accounts, and initiate criminal charges simultaneously. Which meant Daniel wouldn't have time to react, wouldn't have time to escape, wouldn't have time to hide. For the first time since this nightmare began, something inside me shifted completely. Not fear, not anger, something colder. Resolve. But then Mr. Whitaker said one final thing that made my breath catch. "There's just one problem." My eyes lifted to his. "What problem?" He held my gaze. "We still don't know when Phase 2 is scheduled to happen, and without that timing, we couldn't stop him. Not yet, because somewhere out there, Daniel Michael Porter was already preparing his next move, and we didn't know how soon it would come." Chapter 7. On January 9th, exactly 6 days before the deed transfer filing date, I stood in my kitchen at 11:42 p.m., watching Daniel rinse a wine glass as if nothing in the world was wrong. As if he hadn't spent the past year quietly dismantling my life piece by piece. The kitchen light reflected off the faucet in thin, sharp lines, and for a moment, the entire scene looked almost peaceful, almost normal. That was the most dangerous part. Because if you've ever lived beside someone who is secretly planning your financial ruin, you know the scariest thing isn't the lies themselves. It's how ordinary they sound. Before I go further, tell me honestly, could you sit across from someone at dinner knowing they were planning to disappear and leave you with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt? Because for the past week, I had been doing exactly that. And Daniel had no idea. He dried the glass slowly, then turned toward me with that familiar, relaxed smile he always used when he thought everything was under control. "We should book something for Valentine's," he said casually. "Maybe a weekend trip, somewhere warm." The words felt almost surreal. Valentine's. He was talking about a holiday barely 5 weeks away, while secretly planning to vanish before spring. I stirred my tea slowly. "Sounds nice," I replied, and the calmness in my voice wasn't fake anymore. It was deliberate, because after meeting with Mr. Whitaker, my role had changed. I wasn't reacting. I was observing. Watching, waiting. Silence had become my strongest weapon. Mr. Whitaker had been very clear about one thing during our second meeting 3 days earlier. People executing fraud this complex rely on predictability, he told me. If you change your behavior suddenly, he'll accelerate his exit plan. So I did the opposite. I became predictable. I went to work at the same hours, cooked dinner at the same time, laughed at his jokes, asked about his meetings, played the exact role he expected, and it worked, because Daniel's guard had started to drop. Not completely, but enough. He left his laptop open more often. He took calls in the next room instead of going outside. He stopped double-checking paperwork placement. And most importantly, he started talking more. People who think they've already won often do. At 12:07 a.m. that night, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he stepped into the garage to grab something from his car. I didn't rush. I didn't grab it immediately. I waited exactly 3 seconds. Then I picked it up. A message preview glowed on the screen. Melissa Grant. Meeting confirmed. Thursday, 2 p.m. Same place. Same place. My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. Because that message answered the question Mr. Whitaker needed most. Timing. Thursday, January 12th. 3 days before the deed filing. That wasn't coincidence. That was phase 2. I set the phone down exactly where it had been. When Daniel returned, I was still sipping tea, still calm, still quiet. He didn't suspect anything. And that night, lying beside him in bed, I finally understood something deeply unsettling. Daniel wasn't nervous anymore. He wasn't tense. He was relaxed, comfortable, confident, which meant he believed his plan was nearly complete. And that belief made him careless. The next morning at 7:36 a.m., he left for work, humming softly to himself, something he hadn't done in months. That tiny detail told me everything. People only hum when they feel safe. By 8:04 a.m., I was sitting in Mr. Whitaker's office again, relaying the message I had seen. Thursday, 2 p.m., I said. He nodded once, immediately focused. That's likely the final transfer meeting. He turned his monitor toward me, displaying a legal timeline. If he moves remaining assets at that meeting, we can initiate an emergency fraud injunction within hours. The word injunction sounded almost clinical, but its meaning was powerful. It meant we could freeze everything. Accounts, property transfers, corporate filings, Mr. Whitaker continued. But we need proof from that meeting, something irrefutable. I nodded slowly. I can get it. He studied me carefully. You understand the risk? Yes, and I did. Because being physically present meant stepping directly into Daniel's world. It meant letting him see me where I shouldn't be. It meant possibly revealing everything. But it was necessary. Because without concrete evidence, Daniel could still escape legally. Mr. Whitaker leaned back slightly. Then, we prepare. The word prepare carried weight. It meant we were no longer reacting. We were setting a trap. But even as that clarity settled, something unexpected happened that afternoon. At 3:18 p.m., while I was vacuuming the 18th floor executive suites, my phone vibrated in my pocket. An unknown number. I stepped into an empty office and answered quietly. Hello? There was silence on the other end for 2 seconds. Then a voice I recognized immediately spoke. Not Daniel, not Melissa, but someone far more unexpected. Cassandra, the voice said coolly. This is Eleanor Porter, my mother-in-law, the woman whose name sat at the center of Daniel's shell company. My grip tightened slightly on the phone. Yes? Her tone was calm, controlled, almost polite. I think it's time we had a conversation. My pulse slowed because she wasn't calling to ask. She was calling because she knew something. But how much? She continued, her voice smooth as glass. You see, dear, Daniel isn't as careful as he thinks he is. The words sent a chill down my spine because they carried an implication I hadn't considered. She paused before adding quietly, and I believe you've started asking questions. Silence filled my chest because that meant one terrifying possibility. She knew, or at least suspected. But her next sentence made the situation even more dangerous. There are things you don't understand yet, she said softly. Things Daniel hasn't told either of us. Either of us, which meant something critical. Eleanor Porter was not fully aligned with her son. There was conflict, hidden tension, and she ended the call with 5 words that echoed in my mind long after the line went dead. Meet me before Thursday. Then she hung up. I stood there in the silent office, phone still in my hand, staring at nothing. Because suddenly, the situation had shifted again. This wasn't just about Daniel and Melissa anymore. There was a third player in this game, one with legal power, financial knowledge, and unknown motives. And as I slowly exhaled at 3:26 p.m., one question formed with chilling clarity. If Eleanor Porter wasn't fully on Daniel's side, then what exactly was she planning to protect? On January 10th, at exactly 1:06 p.m., I sat across from my mother-in-law in a quiet corner of a private dining room at the Sterling Club, a place where lunch memberships cost $12,000 a year, and watched her stir iced tea with the calm precision of someone who had never once doubted her control over a situation. Outside the tall windows, downtown Dallas traffic moved in slow winter lines, but inside, The air felt unnaturally still. Because if you've ever sat face to face with someone who might have helped orchestrate your financial destruction, you know the silence doesn't feel awkward. It feels strategic. Before I tell you what she said, I want you to think about this. What would you do if the person you believed was your enemy suddenly hinted they might actually be protecting something from you instead? Because that was exactly the position I found myself in. Eleanor Victoria Porter looked exactly as she always had. Perfect posture. Silver hair styled immaculately, a cream wool coat draped over her shoulders like armor, and eyes that missed nothing. She didn't greet me warmly, but she didn't greet me coldly either. She simply studied me for a moment before speaking. "You've lost weight," she said calmly. Not concern, not criticism, just observation. I kept my voice even. "You wanted to talk." She nodded slightly. "Yes." Then she leaned back, folding her hands together. "Daniel thinks he's very clever," she said. Her tone wasn't proud. It was almost tired, and that alone told me something I hadn't expected. She wasn't speaking like a mother defending her son. She was speaking like someone evaluating a liability. I said quietly, "You're listed as managing member of Orchid Harbor Holdings." She didn't flinch. Correct. No denial. No surprise. Just acknowledgement. I held her gaze. "Why?" She took a slow sip of tea before answering. "Because Daniel asked me to be." Her eyes sharpened slightly. "And because I needed to see how far he was willing to go." That sentence shifted the entire atmosphere. Because it revealed something important. Eleanor Porter hadn't just been helping him. She had been watching him. I asked carefully, "You knew he used my name for the loan." It wasn't a question. She exhaled softly. I suspected. Suspected. Not approved. Not encouraged. But not stopped either. The distinction mattered. I leaned forward slightly. "You could have stopped him." She met my eyes directly. "Yes." No apology. No hesitation. Just truth. Then she added quietly, "But if I had stopped him too soon, I would never have seen the full extent of what he's become." The words landed heavier than I expected, because they carried something deeper than indifference. Disappointment, even grief. She continued calmly, "You think this is about money, Cassandra." Her voice lowered slightly. "It isn't." My pulse slowed, because that meant there was another layer, one I hadn't seen yet. She leaned forward just enough to emphasize her next words. "Daniel has been preparing to leave the country for over a year. A year. Long before the loan, long before Seattle, long before I even suspected anything." She continued, "He's been moving assets gradually. Not just marital assets, corporate funds. Corporate." The word sent a chill through me. Because that meant something far more serious than personal fraud. It meant criminal financial activity involving his employer. I said quietly, "Embezzlement." She didn't confirm immediately, but she didn't deny it either. Instead, she said something that made my stomach tighten. "Daniel believes he can outrun consequences." Her eyes hardened slightly. I know better. Silence settled between us. Because suddenly, I understood her position. She wasn't protecting Daniel. She was containing him. I asked slowly, "Then why stay involved at all?" She answered without hesitation. "Because if he disappeared successfully, the legal damage would destroy this family entirely." Family, not son. Not personal loyalty. Legacy. Reputation. Financial stability. Everything Eleanor Porter valued most. She took another sip of tea before continuing. "By allowing him to move forward under my supervision, I've been able to monitor every step, which meant something critical. She knew everything. The Shell Corporation, the property transfer, the timeline, the offshore plans." She set her glass down carefully. "And now," she said quietly, "the time has come to stop him." My chest tightened slightly, because that aligned exactly with what Mr. Whitaker had planned. But Eleanor wasn't finished. "There's something you don't know yet," she added. Of course there was. There was always another layer. I held her gaze. "What?" She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "The meeting on Thursday is not just phase 2. My pulse slowed even further. "What do you mean?" Her eyes locked onto mine. "It's the final transfer. Final." The word felt heavy. She continued, "That meeting is where Daniel intends to move the remaining funds and sign international asset relocation documents. International. Which meant once that happened, Recovering the money would become exponentially harder. She sat back again. "If you want to stop him," she said calmly, "Thursday is your only opportunity." The clarity of her statement made something inside me settle, because now there was no uncertainty, no guessing, just a single moment where everything would converge. But then she said something that shifted the ground beneath me once more. "And there's another reason you must act then." My throat tightened slightly. "What reason?" Her expression grew colder than I had ever seen it. "Because Daniel doesn't intend to leave alone." The words landed like a sudden drop in temperature. I frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" She held my gaze. "He's been planning to take someone else's identity documentation with him." Identity documentation. My mind moved quickly. Passports, social security records, legal identity papers. And then the realization hit me. Hard, cold, impossible to ignore. "You mean?" She nodded once before I could finish. "Yes." Her voice was quiet, but the weight of her next sentence felt crushing. "He's preparing to leave the country using your identity, Cassandra." Silence filled the space between us, because in that moment, everything changed. This wasn't just financial betrayal anymore. This wasn't just fraud. This was something far more dangerous. If Daniel succeeded, he wouldn't just ruin my credit. He could destroy my legal identity entirely. And as I sat there frozen, at 1:39 p.m., Eleanor Porter delivered one final revelation that made my heart drop into something cold and heavy. "He's already obtained a second passport application under your name." She paused, then said the words that echoed long after the conversation ended. "And it's scheduled for processing this Friday." On Thursday, January 12th, at exactly 1:52 p.m., I sat in the driver's seat of my car, parked across the street from a low-rise glass office building in Oak Ridge District, watching Daniel walk inside with a black leather briefcase, the same one he had carried every day for years, knowing that in 8 minutes, he would attempt to complete the final step of a plan designed to erase me from my own life. The winter air was sharp, dry, and painfully clear, the kind of day where nothing can hide, and neither could he anymore. If you've ever waited for the exact moment someone's carefully constructed lies begin to collapse, you know how strange it feels. Not chaotic, not emotional, but intensely focused, like standing at the edge of a cliff, fully aware that one step forward changes everything. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you knew you had one chance to stop someone from stealing your financial future and your legal identity at the same time, would you hesitate? Because I didn't. Not anymore. At 1:54 p.m., I checked the small recording device clipped inside my coat pocket, a legal audio recorder Mr. Whitaker's firm had provided. In Texas, one-party consent laws meant I could legally record any conversation I was part of. And in my bag sat something even more important, a temporary court-prepared affidavit package, ready to be filed the moment we obtained direct proof of fraud. Everything had been timed down to the minute. At 1:57 p.m., Melissa Grant's car pulled into the lot. She stepped out quickly, scanning the area once before walking toward the entrance. She didn't see me, which was exactly how it needed to be, because this was the final stage. The preparation phase was over. Now came exposure. At exactly 2:03 p.m., my phone buzzed. Once a pre-arranged signal from Mr. Whitaker's legal assistant, stationed 2 blocks away. Meeting confirmed. Conference room 4B. That meant they were inside, talking, signing, executing phase 2. My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. Because this was the moment everything we had prepared for would finally converge. I stepped out of the car at 2:05 p.m. and walked calmly toward the building entrance. No rushing, no hesitation. Just controlled, steady movement. Inside, the reception desk was empty, just as Eleanor had predicted. The property had been purchased recently, and the building management was still transitioning tenants, which meant fewer witnesses, fewer interruptions. Exactly the kind of environment Daniel would choose for a final transfer meeting. The elevator ride to the 4th floor took less than 20 seconds, but each second felt heavy with certainty. Because when the doors opened at 2:07 p.m., I knew there was no turning back. The hallway was quiet, muted, the kind of corporate silence I knew well. Conference room 4B sat at the end, its frosted glass door slightly ajar, and through that gap, I could hear voices. Daniel's voice first, confident, relaxed. Once these documents are signed, everything is consolidated. We wire the final funds tomorrow morning. Melissa's voice followed, quieter. And Cassandra? My chest tightened slightly at the sound of my name, spoken like a logistical problem. Daniel chuckled softly. She'll find out eventually. But by then, we'll be long gone. Long gone. Not just emotionally, physically, legally, completely, he continued, voice smooth and assured. The loan liability remains in her name. The deed transfer goes through Monday. By the time she realizes what's happened, recovery will be impossible. Each word felt like another piece of cold confirmation. Not doubt, not suspicion. Proof. Unmistakable. I stepped closer to the door. Melissa spoke again, her tone tense. And the passport issue? Daniel laughed lightly. All handled. Secondary identity processing is already underway. Secondary identity. He was saying it so casually, like it was just another business detail. He continued. Once we're in Costa Rica, Cassandra Porter effectively ceases to exist as a financial threat. The words hit like ice. Because he wasn't just planning to use my identity. He was planning to erase it. To leave me legally buried under debt while he lived under my documentation. And then he said something that made my stomach drop even further. My mother will manage the final asset transfers after we're settled. Silence followed for a second. Then Melissa asked quietly, "You really think she won't turn on you?" Daniel's response came without hesitation. "She never will." That sentence sealed everything, because it proved not just fraud, but intent. Clear, direct, irrefutable. I took one slow breath, then pushed the door open. At exactly 2:10 p.m., the sound made both of them look up instantly. Daniel froze, his face drained of color so quickly it was almost surreal. Melissa's eyes widened. The room went completely silent. For a long moment, no one spoke, because this was the moment reality collided with illusion. I stepped inside, calmly, closed the door behind me, and said quietly, "Hello, Daniel." His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. That was the first stage. Shock. Then it came. Denial. "This isn't what it looks like," he said quickly, standing up. The words were automatic, reflexive. Exactly what someone says when their carefully controlled narrative collapses. I walked slowly toward the conference table. "What does it look like, Daniel?" My voice was calm, steady, completely controlled. He glanced at Melissa, then back at me, his mind clearly racing. "You shouldn't be here," he said. That sentence revealed everything. Not concern, not confusion, just fear of exposure. I stopped at the table and placed my bag down deliberately. Then I said the words that marked the point of no return. "I know about the loan." His face tightened. "I know about the forged deed." His hands curled into fists. "And I know about the passport application." For the first time, real panic flashed across his eyes. Because now he understood something critical. I didn't just suspect, I knew. And then I said the final sentence that shattered the last piece of his control. "And you're being recorded." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, total. Because at that exact moment, Daniel Michael Porter realized his plan hadn't just been discovered. It had been documented. But what he didn't realize yet was that the worst part of his collapse was still waiting just outside that conference room door, and it was about to walk in. At exactly 2:11 p.m. on January 12th, 10 seconds after I told Daniel he was being recorded, the conference room door opened again, and two attorneys, a county fraud investigator, and my mother-in-law stepped inside at the same time. That was the moment his world began to collapse. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with the quiet precision of something inevitable. Because if you've ever watched someone realize they are no longer in control of the narrative they spent years constructing, you know it doesn't look explosive. It looks stunned, frozen, like a system shutting down all at once. Before I continue, I want to ask you something. Have you ever seen someone's confidence disappear in real time? Because what happened next was exactly that. Daniel turned toward the door, confusion flashing across his face. Then, recognition hit. Mr. Whitaker stepped forward calmly, holding a leather folder. "Daniel Michael Porter," he said evenly, "you are now formally notified that this meeting is being documented in connection with an active fraud investigation. Daniel's expression shifted instantly. Shock to denial. His voice rose, sharp and defensive. This is insane. You can't just walk in here making accusations. Classic first reaction. Refusal to accept reality. Mr. Whitaker didn't argue. He simply placed a document on the table. This is a temporary injunction filed with Dallas County at 1:48 p.m. It freezes all asset transfers connected to Orchid Harbor Holdings LLC, effective immediately. Daniel stared at the paper. His eyes moved rapidly as he read, and for the first time, something deeper than shock appeared: fear. Because that injunction meant everything he had spent months preparing was now locked in place. No transfers, no withdrawals, nothing could move. Melissa stepped back slightly, as if instinctively distancing herself from him, Daniel noticed. And that's when his reaction shifted into the next stage: blame. He turned sharply toward her. You told them, he snapped. Melissa flinched. No, Daniel, you did. Every time you underestimated us. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, and that steadiness made his anger spike further. He pointed at her, then at me. This is a setup, he said. You're twisting everything. Mr. Whitaker spoke calmly. No, Mr. Porter, we're documenting facts. He slid another document forward. The printed transcript from the recording device, already processed by a legal assistant in real time. Highlighted lines showed Daniel's own words. Loan liability remains in her name. By the time she realizes, recovery will be impossible. Secondary identity processing is underway. Daniel's face went pale, because those weren't accusations. They were his own statements. He tried to recover quickly, shifting into the third stage: victimhood. You don't understand, he said, his voice suddenly strained. This was complicated. Cassandra and I were having problems. We agreed to restructure finances. The lie sounded desperate now. Fragile. Mr. Whitaker didn't raise his voice. Then you won't mind explaining why we have notarization records showing you impersonated your wife during the deed authorization process. Daniel froze again, because that statement struck at the core of his legal vulnerability. Identity fraud, a felony. Eleanor Porter stepped forward then, her presence quiet but powerful. Daniel, she said calmly. He turned toward her, relief flickering briefly in his eyes. Mom, you need to tell them. She cut him off with a single sentence. I already have. The room went silent, because that was the moment he realized the truth. His mother had not come to defend him. She had come to testify. Daniel's expression shifted into something raw. Betrayal. You knew, he said hoarsely. Eleanor's face didn't soften. Yes. Her voice remained steady. I monitored your actions for months, and when you crossed from deception into criminal fraud, I chose to stop protecting you. Stop protecting. The words landed heavily, because they revealed something Daniel had never expected. His greatest legal shield had become his greatest legal liability. He shook his head, disbelief turning into anger again. You're doing this because of her, he said, pointing at me. No, Eleanor replied calmly. I'm doing this because you chose greed over integrity. Silence followed. Then she added quietly, and because you are willing to destroy an innocent person to escape consequences. That sentence broke something inside him. You could see it. The final stage beginning. Collapse. His shoulders dropped slightly. His voice lost its sharp edge. You don't understand, he said again, but this time it sounded weak. I was trapped. Debt, pressure, expectations. This was my only way out. Mr. Whitaker responded evenly. There are legal ways out of financial pressure, Mr. Porter. Fraud and identity theft are not among them. A county investigator stepped forward then. He spoke clearly. Mr. Porter, based on the evidence collected, you are being formally notified of pending charges, including identity theft, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit asset concealment, and attempted international flight to avoid prosecution. The words fell like final verdicts, because they were. Daniel didn't argue anymore. He didn't shout. He just sat down, slowly, in his chair, staring at nothing. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was heavy, final. I watched him quietly, not with anger, not with triumph, just clarity. Because this wasn't revenge in the explosive sense. This was accountability, precise, measured. I finally spoke. Daniel. He looked up slowly. For the first time, his eyes held no confidence, no manipulation, just exhaustion. You didn't just betray me, I said calmly. You planned to erase me. The sentence hung in the air. And that was when he whispered something that revealed the last piece of truth. I never thought you'd see it in time. Not denial, not justification, just admission. And that admission confirmed something deeply important. He hadn't underestimated the law. He hadn't underestimated the system. He had underestimated me. But as the investigator began explaining next legal steps, one unexpected detail emerged that shifted the situation again. Because when they opened the briefcase Daniel had brought to the meeting, they found something none of us had anticipated. Inside was not just financial paperwork, not just transfer forms, but a sealed envelope labeled in black ink, "Contingency if Cassandra interferes." And as Mr. Whitaker carefully opened it at exactly 2:27 p.m., his expression changed in a way I had never seen before, because whatever was inside that envelope was far worse than anything we had uncovered so far. At exactly 2:27 p.m. on January 12th, in a quiet conference room overlooking Oak Ridge District, Mr. Whitaker opened the sealed envelope Daniel had labeled "Contingency if Cassandra interferes." And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I saw a seasoned fraud attorney visibly lose his composure. Not dramatically, just a subtle tightening around his eyes. The kind of reaction that told you whatever was inside was not just serious. It was dangerous. Because if you've ever watched professionals who deal with crime every day suddenly go still, you know it means something crossed from financial betrayal into something far darker. Before I tell you what was in that envelope, let me ask you something. What would you do if you discovered someone hadn't just planned to ruin you financially, but had prepared a backup plan to destroy your credibility entirely? Because that was exactly what Daniel Michael Porter had done. Mr. Whitaker slowly removed several documents from the envelope and laid them on the conference table. At first glance, they looked like standard legal paperwork, medical forms, insurance authorizations, psychiatric evaluation reports. But as my eyes moved across the pages, a cold, sick realization settled into my chest. The documents all bore my name. And at the top of the first page, in bold letters, were the words, "Involuntary Mental Health Commitment Petition." For a moment, the room seemed to go completely silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning faded into the background. Because what I was looking at wasn't just fraud. It was a plan to legally discredit me. Mr. Whitaker's voice was unusually quiet when he spoke. These are preliminary filings prepared to support a claim that you are mentally unstable and financially irresponsible. Each word felt like ice sliding through my veins, because suddenly, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. If Daniel had successfully committed me, even temporarily, he would have gained legal authority over my financial decisions, control over my accounts, my credit, my property rights, everything. He wouldn't just erase me financially. He would erase my legal autonomy. Melissa gasped softly. Oh my God. Eleanor Porter closed her eyes briefly, as if absorbing a blow she hadn't fully anticipated. Because even she, who had monitored Daniel's actions, clearly hadn't known about this. Mr. Whitaker continued scanning the pages. His jaw tightened. These include fabricated therapist notes, falsified behavioral incident logs, and witness statements. Witness statements. My stomach dropped, because I knew what that meant. Daniel had planned to recruit people to support his claims, or worse, forge their testimony. And then Mr. Whitaker said something that made the situation even more chilling. There's also a draft affidavit claiming you exhibited paranoid delusions about financial conspiracies. Paranoid delusions. The words echoed painfully because they mirrored exactly what I had been uncovering. Daniel had planned to weaponize the truth by labeling it insanity. A perfect strategy. If I tried to expose him, he would claim I was unstable, unreliable, delusional. And the legal system, at least temporarily, would be forced to investigate. During that time, he could disappear. Mr. Whitaker set the documents down slowly. This, he said quietly, escalates this case significantly. I finally found my voice. He planned to institutionalize me, not as a question, as a fact. Mr. Whitaker nodded once. Yes, the single word landed heavily, because this wasn't speculation anymore. It was documented intent. Daniel, who had been silent until now, finally spoke again. His voice sounded hollow. You wouldn't have been hurt. The words were almost absurd, as if stripping someone of their freedom could be considered harmless. I looked at him steadily. You planned to have me declared mentally unfit. He didn't deny it. He just said quietly, it would have been temporary. That sentence cut deeper than any shout could have, because it revealed how completely he had justified his actions. Temporary. As if my life was just an obstacle to be paused. Mr. Whitaker spoke firmly. This constitutes premeditated legal abuse and attempted coercive control. Combined with financial fraud, it establishes clear malicious intent. Malicious intent. A phrase that carried enormous weight in court, because it meant this was no longer just about recovering assets. It was about criminal accountability at the highest level. Eleanor Porter finally spoke then, her voice colder than I had ever heard it. You crossed a line I didn't believe you were capable of. Daniel didn't look at her. He just stared at the table. For the first time, he seemed truly small. Not powerful, not confident, just exposed, broken. And in that moment, something unexpected happened inside me. Not anger, not satisfaction, just a quiet release. Because the final layer of truth had been revealed. Layer 1 had been betrayal. Layer 2 had been financial fraud. Layer 3 was this, total control. Daniel hadn't just wanted to escape consequences. He had wanted to ensure I couldn't fight back. But he had failed completely. Mr. Whitaker gathered the documents carefully. These materials will be submitted as evidence of aggravated intent, he said. This will significantly increase the severity of charges. The investigator nodded. We'll also pursue additional counts related to falsified medical documentation. Everything Daniel had planned as a safeguard had now become evidence against him. A perfect reversal. And that was when I spoke one final sentence to him. A sentence that would later be quoted during court proceedings and shared thousands of times online. I wasn't invisible, Daniel. I held his gaze steadily. You were just too arrogant to see me. The room remained silent after that, because no one needed to say anything else. At 2:49 p.m., as the investigator began formally securing the evidence, Daniel finally asked a question in a low, defeated voice. What happens now? Mr. Whitaker answered calmly. Now, Mr. Porter, you face the consequences you spent a year trying to outrun. And as he was escorted out of the conference room 10 minutes later, shoulders slumped, eyes unfocused, one truth settled quietly inside me. The plan that was meant to erase me had instead erased him. But the story wasn't fully over yet. Because in the days that followed, something unexpected happened that changed not the legal outcome, but the emotional one. Something quiet, something symbolic, something that would finally bring a sense of closure I hadn't realized I still needed. And it began exactly 3 months later, on a calm spring morning in April. On an early April morning, exactly 3 months after Daniel was escorted out of that conference room, I stood alone at 6:32 a.m. inside a quiet, sunlit space that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and new carpet glue, holding a brass key in my hand that represented something I never thought I would feel again. Stability. The sunlight streamed through tall windows, falling across polished concrete floors in long, warm lines. Outside, the Oak Ridge district was already coming alive. Coffee shops opening, commuters walking briskly, the city moving forward the way it always does. And for the first time in over a year, I felt like I was moving forward too. Because if you've ever survived someone trying to dismantle your life piece by piece, you know the real victory isn't loud, it's quiet. It's the moment you realize you're no longer looking over your shoulder. Before I finish this story, I want to ask you something. What do you think real karma looks like? Is it revenge? Or is it simply watching someone face the consequences they created for themselves? Because what happened after Daniel's arrest was not dramatic. It was methodical, legal, final. Within 2 weeks of the injunction, all of Daniel's accounts were frozen permanently. The shell corporation was dismantled under court order. The attempted property transfer was declared void. The loan liability was legally reassigned solely to him after fraud determination. Every system he tried to manipulate had turned against him. And in March, he accepted a plea agreement. 7 years in federal prison for identity theft, financial fraud, and conspiracy. Not because of anger, not because of revenge, because of evidence. Cold, documented, undeniable evidence. Melissa Grant testified early in the investigation. She avoided criminal charges due to cooperation, though she lost her job and professional license for her involvement in the financial scheme. We never spoke again after the court proceedings, not because I hated her, but because she represented a chapter that needed to stay closed. Eleanor Porter was the only one who reached out afterward. She called once, 2 days after sentencing. Her voice sounded older, quieter. "I misjudged you," she said simply, not an apology, but the closest she had ever come. I replied calmly, "You misjudged your son too." There was a long silence. Then she said something I didn't expect. "You were stronger than any of us realized." I didn't respond to that, because strength hadn't been something I chose. It had been something I discovered under pressure. And that discovery had changed me in ways that were both painful and permanent. Which brings me back to that April morning, to the key in my hand. Because the space I stood in that day was not just an office, it was mine. 3 months earlier, after the legal process froze Daniel's assets, the court auctioned several properties connected to the fraud case. One of them was the Oak Ridge office building Daniel had tried to purchase secretly. Through a victim restitution program and with guidance from Mr. Whitaker, I was able to acquire a portion of that property at a reduced legal settlement rate, not as revenge, not as symbolism, but as a practical step toward rebuilding stability. Today, that space is no longer an empty shell. It houses a small but growing business. My business. Cassandra Porter, Property Services. The same skills I once used cleaning corporate offices, observation, attention to detail, understanding how systems work, have now become the foundation of something entirely different. I manage and maintain commercial properties across the district. I set the standards. I decide who gets access. And every evening, when I lock the doors, I am reminded of something deeply simple. I am no longer invisible. The most surprising part of this journey wasn't the legal victory. It wasn't the financial recovery. It was the emotional clarity that came afterward. Because the truth is, Daniel didn't just underestimate my intelligence. He underestimated my ability to endure. And endurance, I learned, is its own form of power. A quiet one, a lasting one. Sometimes, when I walk past the reception desk in the evening, I catch my reflection in the glass doors. Not the woman who stood at an airport arrivals lane months ago, confused and alone, but someone steadier. Someone who understands boundaries now. Clear, unbreakable boundaries. I don't hate Daniel. Hate requires emotional energy he no longer deserves. What I feel instead is distance. Final distance. The kind that allows healing to happen quietly. That allows peace to settle naturally. And perhaps the most symbolic moment of all came last week. At exactly 6:20 p.m., the same time my flight had landed months earlier, I locked the office doors, stepped outside into the warm evening air, and dropped an old set of house keys into a public donation box. Keys to a house that was never truly mine. Keys to a life built on trust that had been broken. And as they disappeared into the slot, I felt something inside me finally close. Not with pain, not with anger, but with calm. Because karma, I realized, isn't about watching someone suffer. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself they tried to take and building something stronger in their place. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, I want to ask you one final question. Do you believe people reveal their true nature when they gain power? Or when they believe no one is watching? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because next time, I'll tell you about the woman who discovered her sister had secretly taken out life insurance policies in her name, and what she did when she found out why.